the UFC is so on fire right now, and it's just like banger after banger after banger. How about the fact that this event, 293, they sold it out in a couple of hours without any of the top fights. Like the main event wasn't even announced. It was just the UFC's coming to Sydney. There's probably it's probably just UFC and WWE as far as sports entertainment is concerned that can do that. They say like, we're coming to town. Let's put the tickets on sale. Like boxing can't do
and
that. Taylor Swift. Yeah, but we know what like we didn't know the main event could have been me versus you, and no one would have returned the tickets. That's how hot the brand is right now. It's crazy.
So here's why I think that's the case. I think we're now in the 2-generation zone with UFC, and even like 2.5, because they have all the kids from, I don't know, 11 to 18. That's the new generation. But now the dads kind of grew up with it, right? And the dads now have the spending money that grew up when they were kids. But then they also have the older generation that just liked it when they were in their 30s in the 2000s that are now in their 50s. So really, it's like 3 generations. So it just feels like where we were in 2000, where it was this oddity and people were arguing about whether it was a human cockfight or not. And the presentation's great. They just do an incredible job with the consistency of the pay-per-views. They're easy to find. The relationship with ESPN Plus, I think, is the best ESPN Plus relationship, right? Like, it's kind of saved ESPN Plus in some ways. So I just think they've figured it out, and it's going well because Dana had that scandal, and it just kind of went away.
Yeah,
I mean, literally did. It just went away. Nobody even cares.
No one said a thing. They're the lifeline of ESPN Plus, and I'm very curious because their deal is up in 2 years. And so I'm super curious to see what happens here, because I think both have benefited from the relationship, right? I think the UFC has become mainstream as a result of the relationship with ESPN. And I think ESPN Plus has been a success because of the UFC. There's nothing, like I was talking about this with someone yesterday. There's no one's top content is on ESPN Plus other than the UFC, right? Like the best NBA games aren't exclusively on ESPN Plus. Their best NFL isn't on ESPN Plus. The best UFC fights are on ESPN Plus exclusively. And so that's been a brilliant move on their part, and it has worked out. But I'm curious to see what happens in the next 2 years, because I suspect the UFC is going to ask for a lot of money. And this better than I
think that's a fair suspicion. Because the ESPN has NBA coming up, but UFC, which never really gets covered, is like, oh my God, NBA, they're going to have to pay through the nose. This is a big reason why their profits might go down. But I think the UFC thing, which they got at a really good deal couple years ago, I think that's the best deal they've made in the last 10 years. And that deal is not going to be there this time around, because you're going to have streamers that are like this, like somebody like Peacock could say like, this is it. Like if we don't get UFC, we might have to merge with somebody else or something. But like if Peacock got UFC and WWE, which makes sense to me because they're going to be merged as in a one company. Like to me, I think you're getting both. And they're going to try to do the 1 + 1 = 3 would be my guess. So if ESPN loses UFC, that's on top of all the other stuff that's happened, disaster.
I do think UFC loves being with ESPN because they love that legitimacy. Dana White has
There's
always
a credibility
wanted to be
there.
Yes,
yeah.
they love to look at the ticker, and the logo is there, and the upcoming fights. They love ESPN.com's coverage. Like they're very into that. But I mean, Peacock, Apple, Amazon, the regular players, I can't see why they wouldn't go after, especially when ESPN Plus bought the pay-per-views exclusively. Because when the deal first started, they were still on DirecTV and in demand. But then midway through the first year, ESPN Plus said, we want all the pay-per-views exclusively. You can't go on any other platform. And initially people were thinking like, man, did they overpay for this? Like the rumor was that they paid the equivalent to what 500,000 buys would be per show. And it's ended up being a brilliant move on ESPN's part, because as you see, like everything funnels through them. You have to subscribe to get the pay-per-views. It's been a grand slam.
Well, especially as ratings just continue to go down all over the place, these things that are just guaranteed audiences is the hardest thing to find. That's why WWE has become more valuable. But with UFC, it feels like the audience is growing. It feels like the one criticism or fear with UFC was always that they wouldn't be able to regenerate stars. That's not a problem. They just over and over again, this guy goes, this guy comes in. The women's division has been huge for them. When you think like where that was 15 years ago versus where it is now, like people have real opinions on all the different classes. And it feels like I don't know how many pay-per-views they're doing a year, like the real ones.
12, 13.
Yeah.
13.
I mean, honestly, they could probably do 20. It's smarter that they keep it so that they're a little more
100%.
special, but they have enough fighters to do more than 12.
Yeah, but
So,
they're doing like 43 or so shows
yeah.
a year, which I think kind of waters down the product a little bit. But they keep obviously the big names for the pay-per-views. However, next weekend, not on pay-per-view, Alexa Grasso, Valentina Shevchenko too. Speaking of the women's fighters for the flyweight title, is going to be on regular ESPN Plus. They actually got the Mexican Independence Day slot at T-Mobile before Canelo. Canelo's fighting on September 30th against Charlo. And so they got that slot, which is gigantic for them. And they're doing sort of, they're calling it Noches UFC. And Alexa Grasso, who's from Mexico, is defending her title against Shevchenko. So that's a huge, huge deal because that slot has always been reserved for Canelo and is always historically a huge, huge weekend for, the Mexican fight fans. So that's another big thing that they're doing. That's coming up next week and that's free.
I'll be interested to see how they coordinate the WWE and UFC, the events, and whether they try to basically own a weekend, stagger things a certain way where it'll be 3-4 day weekends, pick certain spots in the sports schedule where it's like, we just had a pretty dead August. And it's like, do we want to try to own the second weekend of August? Like this is like the biggest weekend of the year for combat and WWE, stuff like that.